My name is Clara, and for the first 28 years of my life, I learned to walk without making a sound. I lived in Port Blossom, a small Oregon town caught between the dense, dripping green of the forests and the relentless gray of the Pacific. It was a place where secrets clung to the air like sea mist. I was raised in a house that was never a home, under the cold watch of my father, Alastair, and his wife, Meredith. My mother, Lily, died when I was 6, a tragedy spoken of in hushed, final tones, like a door being shut forever. After her death, I became a ghost in my own childhood. Alastair, a man whose love seemed to have been buried with his first wife, remarried a year later. Meredith, with her sharp, polished edges, made it her mission to remind me that I was a living relic of a past she'd rather forget. My room was in the damp, finished basement where the scent of earth and rain was a constant companion. At dinner, my plate was an afterthought. My existence was a quiet, apologetic whisper. The only person who saw me, truly saw me, was my grandmother, Nora. She lived in a small, sun-bleached cottage a few miles up the coast, a place that smelled of old books, lavender, and baked bread. She was my sanctuary. "They don't see the light in you, my little wren," she would say, her voice as soft as worn velvet. "But one day, it will be too bright for them to ignore." When she was dying, the world seemed to shrink to the 4 walls of her hospital room. The rhythmic beep of the machines was the only sound, a stark counterpoint to the fading rhythm of her breath. She gripped my hand, her skin as thin as parchment, and pulled me close. Her final words weren't a grand farewell or a lament. They were an instruction, a key whispered into the lock of my life. "Check the silver frames, my little wren," she breathed, her eyes holding mine with a fierce, fading light. And then, she was gone. I thought, in my fog of grief, that she was delirious. But that night, alone in the echoing silence of her cottage, I obeyed. The house was a museum of her life, every object infused with her presence. On the mantelpiece, amidst her collection of sea glass and polished stones, sat a set of ornate silver frames. I'd always loved them. I picked up the largest one, a photograph of my mother and me on a beach, our hair wild in the wind. My hands trembled as I turned it over. Taped to the worn velvet backing was a thick, sealed manila envelope. Inside, the world tilted on its axis. There were documents, letters, and photographs, a meticulously curated archive of a life I never knew I had. But the most important paper was a deed, crisp and official, for a sprawling cliffside property just north of town, a place called Seabrook Crest. I'd heard whispers of it, a secluded, beautiful piece of land with a small, sturdy cottage overlooking the ocean. But the name typed in bold at the top of the deed made me sink to the floor, the rough wood of the floorboards a grounding force against the vertigo. It wasn't Alastair's name. It wasn't Meredith's. It was mine, Clara Annalise Reed. And it had been mine since I was 16 years old. My grandmother, my fierce, quiet Nora, had worked with a trusted attorney years ago to establish a trust, protecting this one piece of my mother's legacy for me. I had been an heiress living as an indentured servant. That truth didn't just give me land. It gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost. It gave me a foundation. For 3 days, I remained at Nora's cottage, telling my father I needed time to mourn. And I did mourn, but I was also working. I combed through every file, every shoebox of letters. I contacted Mr. Hayes, Nora's lawyer, a kind, elderly man who remembered my mother. He confirmed everything. The trust was ironclad. With his guidance, I quietly and legally transferred the assets into a new, private account under my sole control. The sleeping giant of my life was finally awake. When Alastair and Meredith finally arrived, their condolences were brief and practiced. Their real purpose was thinly veiled. "Did Nora ever mention what she planned to do with that old Seabrook property?" Alastair asked, trying for a casual tone. "We were thinking it might be a good time to sell." I looked at him, my face a mask of weary grief I had perfected over 2 decades. "I think she sold it years ago, Dad," I lied, the words feeling foreign but firm in my mouth. "She said she needed the money for medical bills." They bought it without a second thought. To them, I was still the basement girl, too broken to be anything but transparent. That night, back at their house, Alistair came down to my room, his breath soured with whiskey. "You know," he slurred, leaning against the doorframe, "you're not even worth the food you eat. Just like your mother, all dreams and no substance." I said nothing, as always. But inside, the ground had shifted. The tectonic plates of my life had moved. I was no longer the invisible orphan. I was the keeper of secrets, the inheritor of a truth they had tried so hard to bury. And I knew, with a certainty that was as calm and deep as the ocean, that my silence was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. The best kind of retribution isn't shouted from the rooftops. It's built, stone by quiet stone, until it's a fortress they can't breach and a prison they can't escape. Nora had left me more than a deed. She had left me a map. And what I found behind the second silver frame, the one that always hung crookedly in the hallway, sent me down a path I never could have imagined. It led me to a forgotten name, a man whose life my family had shattered to protect their own lies. The second frame was tarnished, its floral engravings dulled with age. Nora had always complained about it, yet it remained. When I pried off the backing, I found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was not an envelope, but a small, folded note and a USB drive. The note, in Nora's elegant cursive, contained a name and a phone number. "Mr. Samuel Finch," it read. "He tried to help. They silenced him. Now you must listen. Mr. Finch, my 8th grade art teacher." A jolt of memory, sharp and painful, shot through me. He was a kind man with gentle hands and eyes that saw more than most. He encouraged my drawing, told me I had a unique way of seeing the world. He was fired abruptly mid-semester. The rumor, spread with vicious speed by Meredith, was inappropriate conduct. My father had led the charge, demanding his dismissal from the school board. I remember being confused and scared. Mr. Finch had only ever been kind. He once kept me after class because I'd come to school with a dark, blossoming bruise on my forearm from where Alistair had grabbed me too hard. He'd asked if everything was all right at home. I, conditioned to protect the family's placid surface, had shaken my head and run away. The next week, he was gone. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. It contained scans of documents, Mr. Finch's letters to the school principal, expressing concern for my well-being. The principal's dismissive replies. And then a grainy audio file. A secret recording Mr. Finch must have made. Alistair's voice, cold and precise. "If you say one more word about my daughter, I will destroy you. I will ruin your name in this town and every town you ever try to work in again." Meredith's voice, like ice. "People will believe us." "Who are you?" "A lonely art teacher." "Who are we?" The recording ended there. They hadn't just fired him. They had threatened him, blackmailed him into silence to cover up their abuse. This wasn't just about a property anymore. This was about a good man's ruined life, a life destroyed to keep me in my cage. My mind, a fortress built to keep out traumatic memories, began to crumble. I went into the attic, a place I rarely ventured, and found an old wooden chest with my name painted on it. Inside were my childhood diaries, the entries growing sparser and more fearful until they stopped entirely around age 12. I found a drawing I'd made for Mr. Finch, a detailed sketch of a seabird that I never got to give him. The memories flooded back, not as a coherent narrative, but as flashes of emotion, the sting of Meredith's words, the heavy silence after my father's rages, the constant, gnawing feeling of being fundamentally wrong. With a trembling hand, I dialed the number from Nora's note. An older man's voice answered, hesitant and weary. "Hello. Is this Samuel Finch?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. "Who is this?" "My name is Clara Reed. Lily and Alistair's daughter." The silence on the other end was profound, heavy with the weight of unspoken years. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandmother told me you might call one day. She said you were a fighter, like your mother. We agreed to meet at a small, misty cafe in a fishing village an hour down the coast. He had aged, his hair was silver now and his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were the same, kind and perceptive. He carried a worn leather briefcase. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, his hands clasped around a warm mug of tea. "She knew they were erasing things, so she made her own copies." He opened the briefcase. It was an archive of my neglect. Copies of school nurse reports noting unexplained bruises. My own artwork from his class, which grew darker and more frantic over the months. Letters between him and Nora. And a photograph of me at a school picnic, age 10, with a haunted, hollow look in my eyes that broke my own heart to see. On the back, Nora had written, "They are starving her soul." "I tried to go to social services," Mr. Finch said, his voice quiet with old pain. But Alastair had connections everywhere. He was a pillar of the community. They buried my report. My career was the price for trying. Leaving that cafe, I clutched the briefcase like a holy relic. It was a testament to the fact that I hadn't been imagining it. My pain was real. It had been witnessed. Nora hadn't just built a financial safety net, she'd woven a web of truth, and now she was entrusting me to pull its threads. That night, I returned to the house in Port Blossom. Alastair was watching a game, and Meredith was on the phone, her laughter sharp and false. They didn't even look up as I passed. They still saw the ghost. But I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was an archaeologist of my own past, and I was about to bring the bones to light. While digging through the garage for more of my mother's forgotten things, I found a box of her old journals, tucked away behind a stack of rotted lumber. They always told me her death was a simple, tragic accident, a fall down the stairs. But as I read my mother's elegant, looping script, a different story emerged, a story of a woman living in quiet terror. The last entry, dated 2 days before she died, was addressed to Nora, a letter she never had the chance to send. The words were a gut punch. "He's not who he seems." His temper. "I'm afraid, Mama. I think I have to leave. I have to get Claire out." The grief was suffocating. I had spent my life believing my mother was fragile, that she had simply slipped. But she hadn't. She had been fighting. She had been planning an escape. And someone had stopped her. The pain morphed into a cold, clear rage. But it was a small photograph tucked between the pages of the last journal that stopped my breath. It showed my mother, radiant and pregnant with me, standing by the fireplace. But it was the reflection in the antique mirror behind her that made my blood run cold. A man stood in the shadows, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the camera. It wasn't my father. My hands shook as I scanned the old photograph into my computer, enlarging and sharpening the reflection. The man's face came into focus, and a sickening wave of recognition washed over me. It was Julian, Alastair's business partner at Blackwood Timber, the man who was a fixture at every family holiday, the man they called Uncle Julian. But back when that photo was taken, he wasn't a partner. I remembered Nora telling me he'd worked as a security consultant for a time. A quick search online confirmed it. He'd been employed by a private security firm that Alastair had on retainer. He was the muscle, the enforcer. His presence in my mother's home, long before he was a friend of the family, felt predatory and wrong. He was the missing piece. It wasn't just Alastair's temper. It was a network. They protected each other, their business, their secrets. Julian was the shadow that ensured the silence. I called Mr. Hayes, my grandmother's lawyer. I set up an emergency meeting, not over the phone, but in his dusty, book-lined office. I laid everything out on his large mahogany desk, the deed, the recordings of Mr. Finch, my mother's journal, and finally, the enlarged photograph. He listened, his face growing grimmer with each piece of evidence. "Clara," he said, his voice low and serious, "this is no longer just a civil matter of inheritance. This is potentially a criminal investigation." Armed with a new, terrifying clarity, I set a small trap. At dinner that evening, with Julian present, I casually placed a copy of the photo on the table. "I found this old picture of Mom," I said, my voice intentionally light. "I don't think I've ever seen it before." Alastair froze for a fraction of a second. Meredith glanced at it, and then quickly looked away. But Julian, ever confident, picked it up and smiled a cold, thin smile. Yes, Lily loved that old mirror. A family heirloom, wasn't it? My heart hammered against my ribs. That's the strange thing, I replied, forcing a puzzled look. I checked the house's old inventory records from the sale. That mirror wasn't installed until a year after she died. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Julian's smile vanished. He had placed himself at the scene, in a time he should not have been there. He had walked right into the trap. That was all the confirmation I needed. Before going to bed, I turned on the voice recorder on my phone and left it on the kitchen counter, hidden in a fruit bowl. I then went to my father's study and began asking innocent questions about the family business, about Julian, about the old days. He was dismissive, but I had planted a seed of doubt. Later that night, from the quiet of my basement room, I listened to the recording. I heard Meredith's panicked whisper from the kitchen. "She's digging, Alistair. She's asking questions. She's just like her mother." His reply was a low, venomous hiss. Her mother learned to be quiet. She will too. Another piece of evidence. Another thread in the noose. I spent the next 2 days compiling everything into a secure digital file, a timeline of abuse, coercion, and suspicious circumstances. I sent it, encrypted, to a respected investigative journalist in Portland whose work Nora had admired. Her reply came in less than an hour. "If this is all verifiable, this is a story that could bring down a king." I didn't want to bring down a king. I wanted justice for a ghost. I wanted to give my mother her voice back. And I wanted to watch their world, built on my silence, burn to the ground. The first official letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier. It was a subpoena. I handed it to Meredith with a steady hand. As she read it, the color drained from her face. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Alistair snatched it from her hand. His face, usually a mask of arrogant composure, crumpled into a stunned, silent gape. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. The state was officially reopening the investigation into my mother's death. The past was no longer buried. It was at their door, and it was demanding to be let in. The house became a pressure cooker of unspoken terror. Alistair's drinking escalated from a nightly habit to a constant state. Meredith, who had wielded her cruelty with such precision, became erratic, swinging between furious accusations and cloying, false sweetness. They whispered in hallways, their words dying whenever I entered a room. I remembered something Nora had told me once, a cryptic remark about the house itself. "That house was built on a lie, Clara. The very foundations are rotten." I dismissed it as poetic metaphor. Now, I wondered. Late one night, driven by that memory, I went down into the cellar. It was a dark, damp space filled with forgotten things. With a flashlight, I began tapping along the old stone walls. Behind a shelf of preserved goods, I heard it, a hollow sound. The stones were a facade. With a crowbar from the tool bench, I pried them loose. Behind them was a small, dark cavity, hidden from the world. Inside was a dust-covered, waterproof metal box. The clasp was rusted shut, but I managed to force it open. The smell of mildew and time filled the air. My heart stopped. Inside were official-looking files sealed with evidence tape from the Port Blossom Police Department. The label read, "Read, Lily, pending, do not remove." These were the original case files. The crime scene photos were stark and horrifying. My mother's body lay at the bottom of the staircase, but she was positioned at an unnatural angle, as if she'd been placed there. The surrounding area was too neat, too clean. And the coroner's preliminary notes, which were missing from the publicly available file, described a contusion on her temple inconsistent with the angle of a fall. The official report, the one that closed the case, had been sanitized. This box held the truth. Nora must have had a contact inside the department who, fearing the evidence would be destroyed, smuggled it to her for safekeeping. Tucked at the bottom of the box was one last letter from my grandmother, addressed to me. "My dearest Wren, if you are reading this, you have found the heart of the rot. Do what I could not. Be smarter than they are. Be braver than I was. Give your mother justice. Tears streamed down my face, not of sadness, but of a fierce, fortified love for the woman who had armed me from beyond the grave. I didn't hesitate. I drove the box straight to Mr. Hayes's home, waking him in the middle of the night. He looked at the contents, his face pale in the dim light of his study. "Clara," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "this is it. This is enough to charge them with murder." The wheels of justice, once rusted shut, began to turn with breathtaking speed. With the new evidence, the district attorney sought warrants for the arrest of Alastair and Meredith Reed. The day they came was quiet and overcast. I was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the police, not yet. It was a plainclothes detective, a woman with kind but serious eyes. She handed me a sealed envelope. "This is from the DA's office," she said. "It's a warning." The letter stated that due to the nature of the evidence, the investigation had expanded. They now believed a wider network might be involved, potentially including public officials who had helped with the original cover-up. They were offering me protection. My quiet act of personal justice had unearthed a sprawling conspiracy. That night, I packed a small bag. Mr. Hayes had arranged for me to stay in a secure apartment in Portland. I left without a word, slipping out of the house before dawn, leaving the ghost behind for good. 2 days later, the news broke. The arrests of Alastair and Meredith were the lead story. Julian was taken into custody shortly after, trying to board a flight to Mexico. The empire of lies was crumbling. In the quiet safety of my new apartment, I finally began to process the enormity of it all. The grief for my mother, the anger at my father, the profound gratitude for my grandmother. But the story wasn't over. In court, during a preliminary hearing, a new witness came forward, a retired coroner who confessed, his voice trembling, that he had been forced to alter my mother's autopsy report 22 years ago. When the prosecutor asked who had given the order, he didn't name my father. He named Alastair's father, my grandfather, a man revered in the community as a paragon of integrity, who had colluded with a corrupt county prosecutor to bury the murder of his own daughter-in-law. The rot went deeper than I had ever imagined. Amidst the legal chaos, a plain brown envelope appeared, slipped under my apartment door. There was no return address. Inside was a single, yellowed piece of paper. It was a copy of a DNA test, dated a month before my mother's death. The results were clear. Under the category biological father, the name listed was not Alastair Reed. It was a name I had never seen before, Leo Vance. The world, which had already been shattered, fractured into a million more pieces. The man I had just helped send to prison for my mother's murder, the man who had tormented me my entire life, was not my father. My call to Isabel, my mother's childhood friend who had fled town after the accident and only recently resurfaced to testify, was short and breathless. When I said the name Leo Vance, she gasped. "Oh, Clara. You need to come see me." At her small, cozy home nestled in the wine country, she laid out a box of old photographs. She pulled one from the top. It showed my mother, young and vibrant, laughing with a handsome man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's Leo," Isabel said softly. "He was the love of her life." She told me the story. My mother had broken off her suffocating engagement to Alastair when she fell in love with Leo. When she discovered she was pregnant, she knew she had to leave Alastair for good. His reaction was not sadness, it was a cold, possessive rage. He couldn't stand the humiliation, the idea of her belonging to someone else. The threats began, and my mother, terrified for her unborn child, was forced back into the fold. Leo, heartbroken and fearing for her safety, was pushed away, eventually leaving the state, believing Lily had chosen Alastair. Aided by a private investigator hired by Mr. Hayes, we found him. Leo Vance was living a quiet life as a woodworker in a small town in Maine. I wrote him a letter, my hands shaking so much I could barely form the words. A week later, he called. His voice was warm, but hesitant, filled with the ghosts of a life he never got to live. We met in a neutral place, a quiet roadside diner halfway between our worlds. The moment he walked in, I knew. I had his eyes. We didn't speak at first. He just held me, a long, grounding hug that felt more like home than any place I had ever known. "I tried to find you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They told me your mother died in an accident and that you were adopted out of state. They erased you." He then handed me a small, sealed envelope, the paper softened with age. "Your mother gave this to Isabel for me, to give to you, if you ever found your way out. She wanted you to have it." I opened it. It was a letter from my mother, written in the last days of her life. "My dearest Clara, my little wren," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I did not make it out. But know this, every choice I made was to keep you safe. The truth is a heavy burden, but living a lie is a slow death. Don't let them silence you. And know, with all your heart, that you were born from love, not from fear." At the end of the letter, she revealed one final secret. She had written a full confession, detailing Alistair's abuse and threats, and hidden it in the heart of the Silent Watcher. It was a cryptic clue, but I knew instantly what she meant. The old porcelain doll that had sat on a shelf in her old room, the one with the unnerving glass eyes that I had always been afraid of. Back in Port Blossom, I went to the old house, now a sealed crime scene, with a police escort. I found the doll in the attic. With trembling fingers, I found a small seam in its cloth body. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, was a multi-page, handwritten document. It was her testimony from the grave, detailed and irrefutable. This final piece of evidence sealed their fates. At the trial, I didn't testify as a victim. I testified as my mother's daughter, as my grandmother's legacy. I spoke of their strength, their love, and their fight. Alistair and Meredith were sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The corrupt officials they had relied on were indicted, their careers ending in disgrace. The storm was finally over. Today, I live at Seabrook Crest. The cottage my grandmother saved for me is filled with light and the sound of the ocean. Leo lives nearby, and we are slowly, carefully, building the family that was stolen from us. With the inheritance, I established the Lily and Nora Foundation, a sanctuary for women and children escaping domestic abuse. It's a place of light, built on the foundations of a dark past. I often walk along the cliffs, the wind whipping my hair, just like in that long-ago photograph. I carry the scars of my past, but they no longer define me. They're a map of where I've been, a testament to the journey. I am not the ghost in the basement. I am not the quiet, apologetic whisper. I am Clara Annalise Vance, daughter of Lily, granddaughter of Nora. I am the keeper of their story, and I am finally, truly free.